Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to David Daley, author of Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy, on Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dumbcast Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dumbcast family of podcasts, coming to you on now a more or less daily basis because there is so much to talk about these days and because I am trapped at home and need something to do. So today on the podcast, I am joined by David Daley, who has a new book coming out today, a very auspicious publication date, called Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. Hi, David.
Hey, Kelly, how are you?
Well, you know, we're all hanging in there. So we have a lot to talk about, I think, but let's start with some background just for listeners who may not know who you are. Tell us just a little bit about who you are and the previous book you wrote, and then we can start talking about this book.
Sure. I was the former editor-in-chief of Salon, and when I was running our politics coverage back in the early 2010s, not long after the 2012 presidential election, I couldn't figure out what happened in the U.S. House in that election that kept it in Republican hands. And I just started looking into it, and I sort of came across this Republican strategy called Red Map, the redistricting majority project that really reinvented and weaponized gerrymandering in such a way that Republicans were able to win 1.4 million fewer votes than Democrats for the House that year and still keep control, and really essentially sabotage the second term of the Obama administration in Congress, and also to sort of give themselves this enduring advantage in state legislatures around the country. And that became the topic of my first book, which came out in 2016. It's called Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. And it sort of explained how the Republicans hit upon this strategy of reinventing and weaponizing gerrymandering, this ancient old trick, and using technology and just a really sophisticated and intense political strategy to rewire the country politically. So the book came out in 2016, and we got to, travel the country and talk about it a little bit. And I thought that we would maybe not talk about it again until after 2020, when people were redistricting again. And then suddenly November 8th, 2016 happens, and the unthinkable happens. And Donald Trump wins the White House by losing the popular vote by 2.8 million, but winning these three gerrymandered states that had all restricted voting rights by 80,000 votes. And a lot of Americans woke up that morning and said, wait a second, this is a closely divided country. How come the Republicans hold all of the power in Washington and in state legislatures around the country in these swing states, even when they win fewer votes? And I'm like, well, I've kind of got a book here, and I can try to explain it for you. And the book got a new life, and I kind of went out and started talking about it a lot again. And I would go to these rooms filled with newly energized woke activists who wanted to do something to fight back. And I'd go in and sort of talk about how wired and rigged the system was and how hard it was going to be to fight back. And, sometimes I could just feel the air coming out of the room as I was talking. And I said, I am not being helpful. I'm not being useful. And I started looking for examples of what was happening around the country to fight back, just so I could provide people with, some sense of uplift in these talks. And what I found was this mass uprising of citizens taking on the hardest structural problems in our democracy: voting rights, redistricting, using the ballot initiative in red states to, expand Medicaid, and just this intense focus on some of the hardest problems that a lot of people said were just not solvable. And I realized that there was, another story to tell here. And I spent most of 2018 out on the road traveling around the country with all of these groups as they won amazing change, as people worked really hard in Utah to win back voting rights for Native Americans that had been systematically denied over generations, as millennials in Michigan won redistricting reform, as this wild coalition in Florida of churchgoers and former felons, of Trump-loving deplorable bikers, and radical criminal justice reformers won back voting rights for former felons in the state for 1.4 million people. As a Secretary of State, who no one had ever heard of, single-handedly shut down Chris Kobach and Mike Pence's quote-unquote voter fraud commission. And it was unbelievably inspiring to go out and ride along and talk to these people who refused to give in to despair and turned off Twitter and didn't give in to anything and just got to work making change. And that's the new book. I tell a lot of those stories.
I love it. And I think a lot of what you're tracking is the kinds of things that we've been sort of looking for and tracking some on this podcast as well. Sort of what can we actually do? I think theory is great, but I want things to sort of do to wrap my hands around and be like, okay, this is the thing that we can do. Would you say then that your book is hopeful?
I would.
I mean, we're in a weird moment here.
We're in a really weird moment. But I really believe that this book is a roadmap back to the country that we want to live in, to the kind of democracy we want to have, and that it's filled with stories of real people making and winning real change. And a lot of them are just regular people who decided that they had to do something. I tell the story in Idaho of 4 natives of the state in their late 20s, early 30s, and their hometown, way up in the northern part of Idaho, had really gotten run over by sort of right-wing preppers and, folks escaping liberal California and moving up to Idaho and really sort of turning it into kind of a frightening outpost. And the school levy there kept being voted down. And they decided that maybe they had some organizing skills that could be used to go out there and win back the school levy and be sure that education was funded properly. And they went out and they knocked doors and they won. They won big. And then they realized, well, that was a lot of fun. What else can we do? And they decided to take on this huge project. They decided to take on Medicaid expansion in Idaho, a bright red state, right? As ruby red as Taylor Swift's lipstick is Idaho. And for the previous 6 years, the legislature had refused to take the Obamacare money from Congress and close that Medicaid gap. And they decided they would do this themselves. One of them had an old RV parked in the driveway from the 1970s. They painted it green. They called it the Medicaid Express, and they started driving it around Idaho, collecting signatures for a ballot initiative. The legislature did everything possible that they could do to make it harder for them. They increased the number of signatures you needed. They increased the number of counties you had to get signatures collected from. They made them go all over the state, and they did it. They collected the signatures, they got it on the ballot, and then in November, they won with more than 63% of the vote in Idaho. These 4 young people started a movement that created this change, and the legislature wasn't going to do it. They did it themselves.
I think what I really like about these stories is how people, so one thing that they're figuring out is what is the issue that I really care about, that really drives me, but also what is the skill set that I already have that I can use, and I think a lot of people don't spend a lot of time thinking about the skill sets they have from other parts of their lives that could translate to grassroots politics. Some people, obviously, you talk about Amanda Littman, and she was already involved in politics and knew that. But for some people, this is something that's totally new for them.
Yeah, I mean, in Michigan, for example, the folks at Voters Not Politicians who won redistricting reform in Michigan. First, it's a magnificent and almost impossible win. If you talk to people nationally, they say Michigan is where good ideas go to die. It costs you a fortune to run a campaign there. You can't win. Try telling that to Voters Not Politicians. Try telling that to Katie Fahey. Katie Fahey wakes up on November 10th of 2016, and she is terrified of what Thanksgiving is going to be like in her house. She imagines, mashed potatoes flying through the air with the Clinton and Trump and Sanders supporters. And she goes to Facebook and she writes, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to be part of this with me, come on along. And then she posts a smiley face emoji, and maybe that's what did it, right? But from that Facebook post, and Katie, worked at it, at a nonprofit working on environmental and recycling issues. She was not a politician in the slightest. But from that Facebook post, it found people, it reached people. They ended up starting a campaign that collected 430,000 signatures. They raised $14 million, and they won independent redistricting in Michigan, a state that needed it so badly because Democrats have won more votes for the state house every single election in this decade, 2012, 14, 16, and 18. They've never once controlled that state house. Republicans had done such a good job drawing those lines that it had entrenched minority rule there. The next decade in Michigan is going to look different because of what these people did, banding together, finding their skill sets. Some of them were carpenters, and so they made the clipboards that folks went out and canvassed with. Everybody had something to contribute, and all of it added up to an amazing victory.
So, of course, you wrote this book pre-COVID-19, but I feel like there's some lessons that we could draw from the book for how we approach a moment like this that feels so overwhelming, so unprecedented, but yet we all have something we could contribute. Have you been thinking about that in those lines, sort of what the lessons are from this book?
Yeah, I have. I think that we talk a lot about, Dr. Martin Luther King's moral arc of the universe being long, but bending towards justice. And what I would say is that it doesn't bend by itself. There are people out there that are trying to pull it backwards and the wrong way. The history of voting rights in this country is not a straight line forward. It is one of, zigs and zags. If it were otherwise, then the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would have settled all this a long time ago, or the Voting Rights Act would have put an end to this kind of stuff back in the 1960s. It didn't. The moral arc of the universe is indeed long, but it only bends towards justice when all of us grab onto it and pull it towards justice. And it's all of our jobs to do that. And some of us, I think, thought that all we had to do was show up and vote, read the news, And that's not enough anymore. There are forces in our politics that are actively trying to bend that arc in a direction that is dangerous, in a direction that could entrench minority rule, that could lead to authoritarianism in such a way that it puts people in power who don't believe in science, who don't plan for a pandemic. And it is all of our responsibility to grab onto that arc and pull it with all of our might in the direction we want it to go if we want this country to be different.
So I asked you if you were hopeful in general. Does that hope extend to the current moment? Do you think that that we can do this? We can band together and sort of pull through what's going on right now, and and have fair elections in November, get the people we need into office, get redistricting done in a way that is, fair to the voters?
I hope we can. I've spent 2 years with the stories of these people who have done unbelievable things. Now, beating back a pandemic is not the same thing as winning redistricting reform, but it's really, really hard to win redistricting reform in Michigan. It's really, really hard to expand Medicaid in Idaho. It's really hard to win felon voting rights in Florida. And these people did the impossible by doing it one step at a time. We are going to have real challenges for our elections. I think we are in deep, uncharted waters here, and we're going to have to act now if we want to be certain that our elections in November are going to be fair and free. We're seeing right now in Ohio and Arizona and all of these, with all the states that have been canceling, and postponing elections into June. We don't even know what June is going to look like. We don't know what November is going to look like. We need to embrace a vote by mail system. There's some real urgency behind it. It's going to take a long time to pull this off. The states are going to have to get optical scanners, and they're going to have to train workers. They're going to have to update their laws to be certain that votes can be counted earlier than Election Day, because Pennsylvania and Michigan don't allow that right now. So if they get deluged with a whole bunch of vote by mail ballots, it's going to be, days or weeks until you know who won those states. And they were pretty important back in 2016. And then we also have to be certain that if you use vote by mail, you're not using it in such a way that you are making it harder for communities of color or Native Americans on tribal land to vote. I mean, vote by mail, and I write about this in the book, has been weaponized by partisans in states like Utah, Arizona, elsewhere, that have been well aware that, in San Juan County, Utah, for example, it's the size of the state of New Jersey, and there are 3 post offices there for the entire Navajo, the people who are living there, and some of them are elderly, and the roads aren't good, and the mail is not reliable or secure. It's the same in a lot of the Latino neighborhoods in Arizona, and there's been litigation about this. So we have to be certain that if we move to vote by mail, we are protecting that foundational notion of one person, one vote. So there's a lot to think about, and we've got 8 months, so we better get to work.
Well, the good news is that this book is available as an ebook for people who are in their houses and need something to do. So tell us how people can get your book.
It's published by W.W. Norton, so it ought to be at every place where you buy books. If you buy your books on Amazon, if you buy your books from an independent bookseller, which especially needs your help right now, so I encourage you to do that. It is super findable out there, and I hope it's an optimistic book that sort of gets us through this moment. If you need some hope, I think you'll find it in the pages of Unrigged.
All right, excellent. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me today. I think we all need a little boost of optimism at the moment. So although this is not perhaps the ideal time to launch a book, it maybe is the ideal time to launch this book.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Kelly, for having me on, and stay safe and healthy. All best to you and your family.
Yes, you as well.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.